Hello and welcome back to AP World History and Modern. Today we're going to begin our first day looking at Unit 5.2. And specifically we're going to be looking at the American Revolution, causes of the American Revolution today. So learn objective, explain causes and effects of various revolutions in the period from 1750 to 1900. So today we'll be dealing with causes of the American Revolution, and then we'll be looking at the effects in the next video. So this is we're on Unit 5.2 here. So these are our standards for Unit 5.2. And as you can see here, there's a lot of moving parts with our standards here today. So we're going to spend some time. We're going to spend a few days looking at the revolutions. So the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, our various Latin American revolutions. And then we'll look at some of the rise of nationalism that occurs as a result of that. All right. So we're going to spend a decent amount of videos on just that. All right. So, but let's go ahead and start today by looking at the American Revolution and causes of the American Revolution. And you know what, assumes you already know a decent amount about the American Revolution. And so hopefully when we see like the Washingtons and Paul Revere's and the such, hopefully you'll recognize, right, a lot of that. When you generally look at the American Revolution, there's I guess a couple of different angles that you can take. To examine this, and of course, the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War is generally the starting point that you begin. And just a couple things to keep in mind when you talk about the 7 Years' War is that this is a war between the British, right, and its colonies against the French and the Spanish, right. Also keep in mind that there is the North American battleground, but it's also a war that is fought all over the planet, right? So it is a war that has global implications, and of course this is kind of an important thing to understand, because today I'm going to be looking at some of how the American Revolution fits in to this kind of global impact. All right. So moving on. All right. So if we're going to talk about this, let's just go over a couple of things. And the way I do this in class, right, is, let's see if I can pop this up. Right, the way I do this in class is we look at some of the major events of the American Revolution, right? And these are things that mostly you're going to be familiar with these, and mostly you're not, right? Or there might be a few that you're not, but for the most part, I think you should understand these things, right? So if you could leave some space over here, right, and just kind of label this causes of the American Revolution. And we're going to start with some individual spark events. So I'm going to zoom in here just so you can see them. We do take a few minutes in class, and we write all these down. All right. So individual spark events. What we're looking for here is what are the causes, or what is the cause of the American Revolution. So my first one here is the 1733 Molasses Act. Then of course the French and Indian War, right? And then we see a number of different acts being put into place. The Sugar Act, Stamp Act, the Townsend Act, and I don't give you the responses to these, but there's responses to every one of those. Then we see the Boston Massacre, right, which is why are there British troops even in the city of Boston? Because of the responses to those various acts. All right, we see the Tea Act, and we see another colonial response. And then you start moving to 1774, right? So the First Continental Congress call for Minutemen to arm themselves and be ready, right, at a minute's notice. And I just did a little scribble there, I made a mistake, so sorry about that. All right. Battle of Lexington conquered, April 18th, 1775. As a kid growing up in Maine, we always had this day off from school. It's Patriots Day. Of course, in kind of greater Boston area, they run the Boston Marathon. as a way, kind of around Patriots Day. So kind of a big deal in New England, specifically in Massachusetts and Maine, because Maine used to be part of Massachusetts until 1820. And it's also, we do celebrate it here locally, right, on St. Simon's Island. We do celebrate Patriots Day, one of the very few places in the United States that does. Right, so that's Battle of Lexington conquered, and then of course immediately following that you see the British siege of Boston, and then shortly thereafter, so in May, you see Benedict Arnold meeting up with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and the taking of Fort Ticonderoga, and that's in upstate New York. It's on the New York Vermont border. It's at Lake Champlain. Very pretty fort. You can still go visit it today. Right. And then in 1775 June, we see the Battle of Bunker Hill, and of course the Battle of Bunker Hill. Technically, it is a British victory, but it is definitely not a loss for the colonists. When you start looking at the casualty ratio, and also the fact that the reason they surrendered because they ran out of ammunition, right? And so they simply retreated. And so Bunker Hill, and then of course we see shortly thereafter the establishment of the Continental Army, with George Washington at its head. Then we see the failed attempts by Benedict Arnold to take Montreal or Quebec City at least. So partially having to do with weather, partially having to do with smallpox, right, for those failures. We see the publishing of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, extremely influential book, right? Washington's victory in Boston, right? Washington's victory, kind of the British will pull out of Boston. And then the last date on this list is the Declaration of Independence. All right. So once you're done copying all that down, right, what we do in class with this is looking at all these dates. Since the American Revolution is the topic that you probably know more about than literally anything else that we have covered in this class, and maybe with the exception of World War II that we will ever cover in this class, let's kind of draw on your expertise for clarification on a couple of things. One is, with these dates in mind, what is the actual start date of the American Revolution? Right? When does the American Revolution actually begin? Right? And if that's not clear enough for you, let me clarify a little bit here for you. All right. So let me give you a couple of factors. All right, factors to consider. All right, factors to consider. So I guess the question is when did the American Revolution begin? When does the American Revolution begin? So, a couple factors to consider is, did the event create, an irreconcilable difference between the colonies and the British government? All right, so does event create an irreconcilable difference between colony and Great Britain? Question mark. All right. Something else to consider is, was there a critical mass of support created by this event in the colonies to take on the British Empire? Right. So it was a critical mass of support generated to take on British. All right. So are we talking about an event that has local implications only, or was there a critical mass, right, that was achieved here as a result? And then, of course, probably the easiest question to ask is if this event had not occurred, or if it had gone differently, would the revolution have continued? Right? Would it have happened? Right. So if event person right, had not occurred, would revolution have continued? Right? Would things continue to have progressed? All right. So with these questions in mind, when does the American Revolution actually begin? Right? When does the revolution actually begin? So in class, we talk about this. Students will kind of talk amongst themselves for a few minutes, and then they will, make a claim, right, about this, and try to support that with an explanation. So these become then kind of evidence, right? And so this is kind of one of those things where when we talk about this in class, there's really no right or wrong answer here. There's only answers that aren't actually explained. Okay, so so you could easily make an argument for July 4th. You could, with a little bit more of a challenge, make an argument that the Molasses Act, right? Just go all the way to the top. Is the answer. So it's just a matter of, can you explain it? Ones in which students had the easiest time, if you're trying to make like a causation, chain, right, argument, this one usually comes up as an easy one to make a causation chain argument that this resulted in A, B, and C, all right, and and I guess probably the second most common one is this. The Battle of Lexington conquered, Patriots Day. And of course, when students will make this argument in class, I will make an argument against them. Just to say that no, it was probably later. Every once in a while, I have a kid who uses common sense, and I think that's a really good one to use. If you want to kind of play around with that critical mass, as your focal point, and you could also deal with this. That's another one that's not totally wrong. And of course, you should be able to argue for or against either one. All right, and so we do this just because you do have a level of familiarity with this topic that you don't have with other topics that we deal with in class, but also just there's a certain reality that I guess kind of as Americans looking at this topic, we want to look at these individual events as indispensable, or even the individuals themselves as indispensable towards revolution in the creation of the United States. But then again, I could make an argument against that, right? So, I could make an argument that if one of these things does not exist, does the revolution still continue? Or give me an example of any one of these things being removed that would have changed the revolution. Or get rid of any of the players involved, right? If George Washington had died as a young man in the French and Indian War, would the revolution have still taken place, and would we have won? Or if Thomas Jefferson, had died of smallpox as a child, would the Declaration have still been written? And of course, there's three other writers of that thing. So, there is a certain reality that individuals, in individual events, we haven't really had to kind of deal with this year because you haven't known enough about any specific topic. So I'm just going to use this left side here and just kind of introduce something to you for the kind of first time, because I don't really introduce it before this, because I think you kind of need kind of this kind of knowledge about a topic to understand that in this class, we mostly deal with what's called systems analysis. We take a systems analysis. So what a systems analysis is right, the basic idea behind this is that the wheels are in motion. right? When you start talking about a topic like the American Revolution, right? The wheels are in motion. There's a certain amount of gravity that exists, and the wheel and the vehicle is rolling down the hill, right, towards a clash between the colonies and the British. And you can take away any individual, and you can take away multiples of these events, and that clash is going to happen because of things that are larger than any one person or any one individual. So, and this is largely how we look at almost every topic thus far this year, and how we will continue to look at topics. The only difference here is that you know a lot about the American Revolution, so you know the kind of the minutia associated with these events. So what we're going to do with this systems analysis is what we've done the entire year, is I'm going to give you categories of analysis. And the question is do these fall in as evidence for these categories of analysis or not? So let me just give you a couple, right? Couple examples of categories of analysis, all right? So number one, natural rights. Right. Natural rights. What am I referring to here? I'm referring to the Enlightenment. Right, referring to the Enlightenment. And let's just kind of keep this very, very simple. In the colonies, right? So in the colonies, there is a tradition of self-rule. Okay, and this is not an individual thing, once you go beyond like John Locke, right? So once you go beyond John Locke putting pen to paper, with the English Bill of Rights during the Glorious Revolution, and his two treaties, shortly after that, once you get beyond John Locke, then the wheels are in motion, right? When you start talking about the American Revolution, you have these ideals as a British citizen that you have certain rights, and self-governance is a part of that, and that rises up as the colonies are created. So and for the most part, you've all, for whatever reason, everyone remembers the House of Burgesses in Virginia, but we see these types of legislative bodies forming wherever the colonies are, right? So there is a tradition throughout the colonies of self-rule, of application of John Locke-based governance, and just Enlightenment ideals in general, right? The natural rights and the preservation thereof. All right, so we see this. And when you want to start talking about making connections between these things, anytime, right, when you start looking at the problems that the colonists have with these things, right, and of course this thing, right, when you start talking about why the colonists were upset by these things, then that is all connected to evidence supporting that natural rights is a part of it, right? This notion of representation. All right, this notion of representation that existed by the colonists, right? And of course, you've got two different groups over here, right? You've got Parliament, right? And let's just say England, and then you have the colonies, right? And of course, these people believe they are British, whereas these people do not believe colonists are British. All the rights that are given and owed to the British don't apply to the colonists, right? And this is kind of an underlying issue here. So if you want to start taking this as our category of analysis, how can we support that with evidence? That every time we see an act that that is being passed upon that applies to the colonists, they're upset that they don't have representation, because they have a tradition of representation, and that they should have a tradition of representation because they are a stakeholder in this society, right? As a British citizen, they should have that right to representation. All right, our second point here, All right, our second kind of major category of analysis, right, is salutary neglect. All right, salutary neglect. So, and just as a kind of a quick little reminder here, I've got a nice little summary of salutary neglect. Get away from this debt issue here. And I think this comes from the Standish piece, right? Policy of the British government from the early to mid 18th century regarding North American colonies, under which trade regulations for colonies were laxly enforced and imperial supervision of internal colonial affairs was loose, as long as the colonies remained loyal to the British government and contributed to the economic profitability of Britain. This salutary neglect contributed involuntarily to the increasing autonomy of colonial legal and legislative institutions, which ultimately led to American independence. So salutary neglect has a couple of different connections here. One of those connections is with the rise of those legislative bodies, right, and their ability to rule themselves. Okay, so let me just kind of throw this in here as a connection. Right, so part of it is political. Right, there's a political impact, hence this whole issue rising up. Right, but there's also another impact, right? Kind of another angle you can look at this, and this is economic. All right, so what we're seeing here is, right, like a neglectful parent. The colonies were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do, right, and raise themselves, in violation of the rules of mercantilism, right? So just as a reminder of mercantilism, right, you're supposed to have the colony, and you're supposed to have the parent country, and right, colonies. Zoom in a little bit because I'm going to write this a little small. Right, colonies exist for benefit of parent country, right? Which means it is all about resource extraction. Right? Resource extraction is why colonialism exists. So what does that mean? That means whatever is valuable in the colony, right, is going to be brought to the parent country. So in the case of like Gran Peru or New Spain, silver is the resource that is being extracted out of those colonies. In the case of Brazil, for the Portuguese, or Saint Domingue, which eventually becomes Haiti for the French, right? Sugarcane. So the soil is being, exploited for the benefit of the parent country, right? So those goods go to France. In the case of sugarcane, or Jamaica, sugarcane for the British, right? So, in the case of the 13 colonies, you've got things like tobacco in Virginia, right? Whaling and cod, maybe for New England because of their rocky soil, right? So under the rules of mercantilism, right, colonies are supposed to give their wealth, right? Any resources that are being extracted, be it mineral wealth or be it from the soil, to the parent country. And then manufactured goods are then going to be created and sold back to the colonies. So the colonies are a pure profit center, right, for parent countries. Now, what happens in the colonies of North America is this all just got ignored, right? This all just got ignored and was allowed to not be enforced, right? And we know that it went on for a very, very long time, right? So salutary neglect economically, right, went on for a long time. And we know this because if we look back up at our dates, we see an attempt to end salutary neglect going back 30 years before the end of the 7 Years' War, all the way back to 1733. Right? So our first kind of real attempt to get rid of salutary neglect occurs in 1733 with the Molasses Act. So what is the Molasses Act? Molasses, if you don't know, it's basically just sugar. Right? And of course, that sugar is a required ingredient if you are making rum. So maybe you could call this an alcohol tax. Right? But also it is, sugar is also used for baking. Those famous New England baked beans and molasses cookies and the such. Right? So it is a baking product as well, right, for food purposes, in addition to rum. All right, so we see a half-hearted attempt to end salutary neglect in 1733. But what happens? We see inspectors going to the major port cities, and those inspectors largely take bribes and allow salutary neglect to continue. So what does this mean? This means we have an evolving economic system rising independent from mercantilism, right? So if you want to look at where are the origins of free market capitalism, there's an incubator taking place in the 13 colonies. And that incubator had been going on for generations, right? And I say generations because from 1733 up until, if you want to take this date as our start date, from here to the first kind of real attempt, right, after that, you're talking 30 plus years, which back then is a full generation, right? And obviously, salutary neglect occurred before 1733 because the Molasses Act is an attempt to get to end salutary neglect. So let's just say conservatively that economically, merchants were allowed to do business with whomever they wanted, going back at least 2 to 3 generations, right? So if I wanted to buy molasses before 1733, I was buying them from the French in Saint Domingue, or I was buying them from the Portuguese in Brazil, or I was buying them from the British in Jamaica. I was buying from wherever they were the cheapest and whoever I had my relationships with and wherever my profit margins were the best. And that occurred right up until the 1760s. So I might need to give a kickback if I'm not buying from Jamaica. So that would have to factor into my decision-making matrix. But other than that, it was allowed to continue. So now you got to put yourself in the position of a 16, 17-year-old kid. You're now getting ready to take over dad's business. Dad has been able to do business with whomever he has wanted. Your grandfather could do the same, probably his father as well. So going back to at least your great-great-grandfather was allowed to have the freedom of choice when it comes to economic activity. And now the government is stepping in and saying, hold up, you need to live under the rules of mercantilism, right? So the freedoms that have been enjoyed by your parents and grandparents, you are no longer going to enjoy those freedoms. So when we talk about salutary neglect, right, this creates an ideal that colonists expected to be able to have, right? This idea of freedom, of economic freedom, to be able to do business with whomever you wanted to, all right? And of course, this brings us to our third major and our last one of today, right? Category of analysis for the causes is the reimposition. The reimposition of mercantilistic policies. I'm going to put a little slash here because I want to give you a little bit more specific regarding this attempt to centralize, right? To centralize colonial activity, to right over to Leadenhall Street. Okay, so all right. So there's an attempt by the British, right, attempt to centralize colonial activity. And of course, this is a relationship between Parliament and who is the headquarters over on Leadenhall Street. This is the British East India Company, right? The BEIC, the British East India Company. So we see an attempt to centralize activity over to Leadenhall Street. All right. So, right, what are we seeing here? What we're seeing here is, right, when you kind of look at this, there's a couple of things that happen in the immediate aftermath of the 7 Years' War that kind of go beyond just debt. So debt is the ultimate driver, and debt is what is leading to all these different acts to be passed, right? But these acts are also part of something bigger going on, right? Back up there, right? So the debt is kind of part of something bigger going on at this point. There we go. Leave that up there for a minute. Okay, so most are familiar with the fact that the British government is going to attempt to increase the revenues following the 7 Years' War, right? But what's going on over in India, right? And I'm going to try to make a connection here to what's going on in the Indian Ocean world and what's going on in the colonies. So in South Asian history, the 7 Years' War, right? And of course, the French will lose a series of battles in the Indian Ocean, right, during the 7 Years' War. But in South Asia, there's also something known as the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761. So it coincides with the 7 Years' War, but it's disconnected. So the British are not directly involved in this battle, but this battle is going to result in a group known as the Marathas and what is known as the Moroccan Confederacy, which we mentioned them in this class earlier when we talked about Aurangzeb. So, but this is going to be a battle between the Moroccan Confederacy, which kind of begins its story under Aurangzeb and religious persecution of Hindus under Aurangzeb, and them coming, doing battle with what is left of the Mughals, right? And the result of this is a highly fragmented South Asia, right? So what was once a formidable force, being the Mughals, you now have what was a rising force coming to an end, right? So the Battle of Panipat is going to be, is going to end the expansion and growth of the Marathas. So what we end up with is a fragmented South Asia. So you have a fragmented South Asia, right, between the Mughals and the Marathas at a time when the British gain a monopoly in South Asia. And of course, the British are gaining a monopoly in South Asia at a time which has increasing demand for tea coming out of China, right? So let's kind of connect some dots here. The British, with their newfound monopoly, are going to make sure they do not, waste this opportunity. And you're going to see the British East India Company start to increase its military presence in South Asia. So, for example, British East India military forces are going to expand from about 3,000 regular forces in around the time of the 7 Years' War, up to about 26,000 by the time the 7 Years' War comes to an end, and that's going to expand to 67,000 by the time you get to the time when the American Revolution gets up and running, so 1778. So you're seeing a large expansion in military forces by the British East India Company in South Asia itself. Thus, they got that monopoly because of the 7 Years' War, and British East India Company is going to do everything it can to maintain that monopoly, right? So why is this monopoly so important? Because if you can monopolize the trade coming out of South Asia, you can monopolize the opium trade, right? And if you can monopolize the opium trade, that means you can largely control the tea trade coming out of China. And so when you look at these events that caused the American Revolution, right, this is about a consolidation and centralization of trade going on specifically in the Indian Ocean, and the colonies in North America were simply part of this larger agreement plan between Parliament and the British East India Company, right? And we are seeing spillover happening, happening here. Okay, and of course, this is kind of no greater is this symbolized than by looking at the Tea Act, right? So what was the Tea Act? The Tea Act theoretically was, would have been good for your average colonist, right? The Tea Act would have been good for your average colonist. It actually would have, make this clear. The Tea Act would have made tea cheaper if American colonies could have only purchased tea from the British, right? So because that monopoly was getting up and running by this point, and the price of tea was going down as a result. So this technically would have been good for the American colonists, unless of course you were a merchant. And if you were a merchant, then this would have impacted your bottom line negatively. Thus, we're going to see a merchant reaction to this. So the Sons of Liberty, who are being funded by merchants, are going to react to this. Okay, so when you kind of start getting into these, it becomes a little bit more complex. If you're just saying that this is a cause of this was the start of the revolution. Is the Boston Tea Party the start of the revolution? No, I mean, this is an economic act, kind of against a larger policy that you are, that you are protesting. And even though it may have benefited people by having lower prices, it would have been damaging to the future of your freedoms, right? So this is, it becomes a little bit more complex when you start actually kind of digging into it. But for our purposes, we need to understand categories of analysis, and we need to be able to show evidence to support these in, off this list, all right? So, right, this could obviously be supported by the application that we're seeing in 1773. And of course, we see the colonial reaction to that. Okay, all right. So that's kind of the bulk of how we cover this topic in class. We do take a few minutes, and I show a video. If I can find it, here we go. So we do take a few minutes, depending on how much time we have left in class. We watch the oversimplified, the American Revolution. We start about 2 or so minutes in. I kind of hop around here and there a little bit. And I like this, just it talks about these events and kind of gives you a little bit of visual after we've talked about it in class. So we watch a few minutes of this here and there. And that's really about it, all right? And so we don't necessarily, kind of go through all these slides in class. All right, we just kind of talked about these major causes of the revolution, and we give some evidence of them. Okay, all right, that's kind of where we stop for today. All right, and then we'll start looking at some effects in class tomorrow. So the American Revolution is caused by a variety of factors. Right, salutary neglect is a huge thing, and of course, natural rights, Enlightenment, that tradition, that they thought functioned as a co-equal with Parliament, and of course, the revolts and whatnot in South Asia between the Marathas and the Mughals, right, resulting in a highly fragmented South Asia at a time in which the British East India Company pushed out the French and other competition. So a monopoly is created. So we see that relationship bridging between Parliament and their corporate partners, right? As all being functional causes. And we'll talk about this other stuff, A and B, tomorrow. All right, that is all for today. Sabriati.